So recently I put out a tweet asking you to all send me your best Halo hot takes, and yeah, there was a lot. So today I'm of course going to be taking a look at some of your hottest takes and giving my overall thoughts and opinions on them. So as I mentioned, there is of course a lot of comments under this post, over 200 at the time of recording, which is simply just too many for me to cover in one video. I do want to cover a few of them separately in some upcoming shorts, just because I think a few of the takes that people had are actually some really interesting topics that I'd like to delve into a little bit more, but I will try my best to tackle quite a few of them today. There was also a handful of extremely similar takes, which is bound to happen. People are obviously going to share the same opinion on some of these matters, so there is definitely some overlap in some of the replies on the post. So I'm not going to be going over like every single comment about a specific game being better or underrated, but for some of those points I will generalize them. Now anyways, without wasting any more of time, let's jump straight in. Our first hot take comes from Designated Kitty, and their take was that Halo has too many precision headshot weapons and it makes the sandbox incredibly boring. And this is definitely something I can see myself agreeing with to an extent. It's definitely one of the biggest problems I have specifically with Infinite Sandbox 2. Don't get me wrong, I love the battle rifle and I'm a big fan of weapons like the Commando, the Stalker rifle, the Bandit rifle, but there is certainly a ton of overlap. And even in prior games, don't get me wrong, again, I love weapons like the Carbine and pick it up almost every single time that I see it. But it does feel like the majority of the time in most of these Halo titles, most of the weapons in the sandbox are headshot precision weapons. And again, most of the time they tend to dominate the sandbox too, as they're extremely versatile, even in regards to power weapons. Sure, you do have some really cool things there like the Spanker, the Energy Sword, the Gravity Hammer, but they can often get outclassed if there's a sniper rifle on the map, as someone can just set up camp and safely pop your head halfway across the map. And I do think this is an issue that is much more noticeable in modes like Big Team Battle, where you're in much more open spaces. In Arena, for the most part, there tends to be maps with more cover, so it doesn't feel like as much of an issue. But as I mentioned on BTB, when you're just in this big open environment, and of course depending on which Halo game you're playing, there might be quite a few headshot precision weapons available. Like if we're talking Halo 5, you've got the battle rifle, you've got the DMR, you've got the Halo 2 battle rifle, you've got the Magnum, you've got the Carbine, you've got the light rifle, and so many more. And in something like Warzone, this can really become a hassle. And it's a shame too, because Halo alongside these weapons does have some incredibly fun additions. In Halo 3 you have things like the Brute Shot or the Mauler, and going forward to Infinite you've got something like the Ravager, which I think is an incredibly cool addition, but most of the time it just doesn't feel as useful when there's enemy players that are likely going to beam you from halfway across the map with a battle rifle. Our next take comes from SpookyBlue, and they said that 343/Halo Studios caters too much to the esports crowd. And I'm definitely quite mixed on this. I can fully understand this viewpoint, and it is definitely a true statement to an extent. It's very apparent with the big spectacle they put on with stuff like HCS. So there is definitely a lot of catering towards that competitive crowd. However, that is also something that helps fund development for more casual modes too. It helps to fund the game, which then leads to a variety of content that isn't just exclusively esports modes. I mean, again, if we're looking specifically at Halo Infinite, most of the recent additions have been casual additions, stuff like Alpha Infected, which was added yesterday. Over the past few months, we have modes like Headhunter and Juggernaut make their way to the game, and these aren't exactly esports or competitive modes. In fact, I don't think the Ranked playlist has received any major content update since Interference was added quite a few months ago. So although yes, there is definitely a lot of catering towards the esports crowd, especially in the way that Halo games, at least as of right now, do feel extremely competitive, we do also still get a lot of casual and social content, to where if anything I actually feel like there's a pretty solid balance of both. And also I don't actually think this is that much of a hot take. I think a lot of people have shared around the same argument, and I believe this mostly stemmed back from during the winter update when they sat down with Sean Barron, who was the head of live service. And he of course had his statement about how Halo has always been a competitive game, which I know this is something I've spoken about before, but I do think that was just a bit of a poorly worded statement, because again, I completely see where he's coming from with that. Halo at its core has always been competitive, while also still being casual. When you're sitting there having a nice little LAN party with your friends or playing online over Xbox Live, even if it's just you and your friends goofing off, most of the time you're still in it to win. You want those bragging rights of being able to laugh in your friend's face and tell them that you're better, even if that's in a fun social setting, even if that's on a stupid mode like Juggernaut. So I do think Halo is a game series that has always retained a somewhat competitive element, even in its most casual of settings. But again, looping back, I can fully understand why some people on the more social side of things would definitely see that 343 feels like they're catering more to a competitive side. But in reality, I think if anything, there's a pretty good 50-50 split that might actually lean slightly more in favour of the casual side in terms of content that's added to games and stuff that's been releasing. The next hot take is definitely a hot take, and this comes from Zombie Cupcake. They stated that they don't like ODST. It was a $60 3-hour-long DLC that's full of reused assets, adds nothing to the overall story, missing sandbox items, generic characters, boring repetitive city, worst firefight mode in the series, and doesn't even have its own dedicated multiplayer. Now, the only real thing that I think I agree with there is the price tag. I don't think ODST should have cost as much as it did when it launched, and really, if anything, should have been a story DLC pack for Halo 3. Of course, the game does reuse a lot of assets, which is another thing that I think goes against its price tag, why it shouldn't have cost anywhere near as much as it did. I think the sandbox for ODST for what it is completely fine with it just being a story-centric game overall. There is actually a couple of additions from ODST that I really enjoy, being of course the suppressed SMG and the tactical Magnum, and I was actually really glad when they added those things to Halo 3's multiplayer and Master Chief Collection. Overall, I actually think I enjoy ODST's firefight much more than some of the more recent additions. I prefer the more arcade style it's got going for it in comparison to Halo Reach. And again, although this is more recent with it being Master Chief Collection and not the original game, Flood Fight is also incredibly fun. The characters being generic, I can somewhat understand that statement. I think a lot of them do sort of fall into archetypes and do feel like characters that have been seen in media tons and tons of time in the past. But for what they are, I still really enjoy them, and of course Buck is a fan favourite, and I think he deserves that fan favourite title. Buck is a really enjoyable character. I didn't necessarily find the city boring or repetitive. I actually found it quite fun to explore, but of course the game doesn't have its own dedicated multiplayer, and that is something that I'd actually really like to see. They do also actually carry on with their statement, saying the gameplay was disappointing, stamina instead of shields and guns doing less damage doesn't make me feel like an ODST, just a gimped Spartan, and detective or not, the rookie being able to tell exactly what happened that night from a piece of shrapnel is dumb. And again, I'm still incredibly mixed on this. I enjoy ODST's gameplay. I think the movements of the game does make you feel much more human. You can tell that you don't have those same augmentations that a Spartan has. But yes, considering you are using the same weapons that you'd be using in any other Halo game, the weapons should not feel weaker. I can understand something like the suppressed SMG and tactical Magnum feeling weaker as they serve sort of a different role, but this is something that I can understand that does feel a little bit silly. And again, going over to Rookie being able to basically pick up everything that happened from a piece of shrapnel, I do feel like that's sort of simplifying it a bit. There is a little bit more that goes on other than just that, but it would be cool if Rookie was given a bit more personality, and if you had to do a bit more detective work to really figure out what happened. But of course, again, I kind of understand why they keep everything so minimal with Rookie. Again, he's supposed to be a complete John Doe, a vessel for the player to project themselves onto. ODST overall, I think, is a really fun game. I do really enjoy the story. I think it's got an incredible soundtrack, and I like firefight and some of the stuff that ODST does. But I can also fully understand that for some people, it's not everyone's cup of tea. And again, considering it cost as much as it did when it launched, I can fully understand why some people would think that it's quite underwhelming. It definitely shouldn't have cost that much and probably should have just been a DLC pack for Halo 3, or have had a much lower price tag on its launch. I think if it did have its own dedicated multiplayer, the price tag wouldn't seem as bad, because people would have more of a reason to stick around and carry on playing it outside of just firefight. But overall, this one is definitely an extremely hot take. There's a few things there that I can kind of understand, and there's some tiny little bits that I can kind of agree with, but overall this is an opinion that I wouldn't really say that I share. Our next take comes from Girl in the Bot, and they had 3 points here. First of all, a majority of Halo fans will never be happy because they are blinded by nostalgia. And although I wouldn't say this is quite a majority, I would definitely say there is a handful of people within the community that this affects. A lot of people cling to the past so much, it really makes you wonder if it's because the old games were better, or if that was of course just when they enjoyed them more. And I'm not getting into an argument here about whether modern or classic Halo is better, but there is definitely a good handful of people who are nostalgia blind and won't accept anything that's new because it's not the same thing that they played when they were a kid or when they were in high school or whatever. The next point was people need to realize that Spartans aren't just walking tanks, and again, this is another one that I see myself agreeing with. Although Spartans are definitely walking tanks, especially Spartan 2s, They are so much more than that, and we've been shown this time and time again. Originally in Combat Evolved, yes, Chief was, like we mentioned with Rookie, a vessel for the player, someone to project themselves onto, but his character grew so much more over the next few games. You see his relationship grow with those around him, whether that be Cortana, Johnson, the Arbiter, even the way that he responds to threats like Gravemind or Guilty Spark, and I'm only talking the first 3 games here. Chief very quickly became more than just a vessel, he became a character, and that is why so many people love him. Again, I don't feel like there's a ton of people that have this idea that Spartans are just walking tanks. I feel like it's just a loud handful of people on the internet. I mean, Halo 4 came out over a decade ago now, and that added a lot of character to Chief and other Spartans. Same with Halo Reach too. That gave noble team personalities, and you see that Spartans are in fact human and not just walking machines. Again, I feel like this is something that just kind of connects to their first point, where there's a lot of people that are blinded by nostalgia, or it can also just be some people that are just sort of ignorant to the storytelling that's going on in the game. Their final point is that Halo's universe deserves more variety with style of game, instead of being tied down to just being an arena shooter, and again, this is another thing that I agree with. Halo has such a rich universe, there are so many stories that you can tell, there's so many different styles of game that you can make that would fit into the Halo universe perfectly. I did make a video a couple of weeks ago talking about different ideas for Halo spin-offs that I would like to see, so I'll just leave that up on screen real quick now. Obviously, we have seen Halo spin-offs before, things like Halo Wars, Spartan Strike, Spartan Assault, but it would be cool to see some more big titles that take up completely different genres. I mean, hell, I'd not be opposed to some silly little arcade racing game. I mean, in my opinion, the more Halo we have, the better. Our next one comes from Sev of 76, where they stated that BTB is too small scale. A mode like Battlefield and Battlefront would be great, even if still spawns instead of specific units. This is another one that I'm mixed on. I wouldn't say that BTB feels too small, unless we're specifically talking about Halo Infinite. And the only reason I say that is, of course, they had this big marketing push originally when they were speaking about BTB, about how it was BTB 2.0, it's Big Team Battle evolved. And then in reality, it didn't really feel like it did all that much that was different from the original games. It was just Big Team Battle, but now there's an extra handful of spawns on the battlefield. Oh, and Pelican drops too, I guess. But at the same time, having something that's a much bigger mode with a higher player count that feels like an all-out war would be extremely entertaining. I think Warzone from Halo 5 did a great job at being this evolution to Big Team Battle, and again, I'm sorry to promote all the videos, but this is another one that I made just a couple of weeks ago, how I spoke about how they should bring Warzone back, how it's an incredible mode if you ignore the pay-to-win side of things. So although I don't think BTB is too small scale, I mean, again, if we're just specifically talking Infinite right now, you have Squad Battle, which is that more classic BTB experience with the 8v8, and when you introduce things like vehicle play into the combat, I don't think it makes it feel small. In any Halo game with BTB, as long as you're on a map that has vehicle combat, it tends to often feel like there is a lot going on that sometimes it can be hard to keep up with. Our next one comes from Rock is Infinite, who stated that Halo Infinite's multiplayer should be judged as a free-to-play game. Comparing it to any of the previous console-only games in the franchise that also used popular monetization models of their time doesn't make any sense. And this is another one that I partially agree with and partially disagree with. I believe those comparisons should be there, just not in the same way. I can understand why people would compare Halo Infinite to multiplayer to the multiplayer of Halo 3, to the multiplayer of Halo Reach 2 and Combat Evolved, and even to the multiplayer of Halo 4 and 5, because of course at the end of the day they are all Halo games, but I feel like at the same time people really need to consider that Infinite is a free-to-play game, which is why I personally don't mind them monetizing something like multiplayer cosmetics, something that don't affect the gameplay and don't break up the player base, like something we'd seen in previous titles with map packs, which of course I think every Halo game up until Halo 5 had. I know some people miss map packs and thought they were cool, but personally I'd rather just be charged for something like cosmetics that don't affect the gameplay than need to pay for something that adds additional gameplay content. And I feel like, to be fair, the monetization is the main thing that draws comparison between both entries. Whenever there's some new armor that's added to Infinite, most people will say like, oh, well, if that was in Halo 3, I could have earned it for free. Oh, the Haunted Helmet, that was so much harder to earn in Halo Reach. But now in Infinite, I can just buy it if I want to. I think for the most part, as far as comparing it to even other free-to-play games on the market right now, like Fortnite, Infinite still does a decent job at offering free cosmetics for players to unlock. We get monthly operations, which of course give you a set of armor each time. And then more recently, we have the addition of the exchange, which has brought back a ton of older things and occasionally some newer items that players can grind for to unlock. So it does actually offer a ton of things for people to work towards even without spending money. But because of course there is so much that's locked behind a paywall, I think that is really what draws in some of those comparisons and what gives Infinite's monetization a lot of flack. But then looping around and comparing it to other free-to-play games, a lot of them weaponize FOMO so much more than Infinite does. Again, looking at something like Fortnite, which I would argue is the top free-to-play game on the market and has been dominating that scene for a very long time now, Fortnite weaponizes FOMO very, very heavily. And one thing I've always appreciated about Infinite is, although it does still have elements of it here and there, it is nowhere near as bad. Especially when you think about things like Battle Passes, how Infinites are permanently available. I think those comparisons should be there with prior games from a gameplay sense in terms of how the game plays, how the mechanics work. But then when looking at monetization methods, I don't really think it's a fair comparison because one is a full-priced game and one is completely free to play. Now, if you want to compare the campaigns, that's a different story, but that's an entirely different topic. The next statement comes from Naga JC, and they said that Agent Locke was a good character. I don't think Locke was a bad character. I just think Locke was a bit of a nothing character. I just don't think Locke was fleshed out anywhere near as much as he should have been. And personally, to be fair, I would have liked to have seen more of him, maybe within Halo Infinite or some other kind of Halo project, because I feel like there's a lot of potential there. I feel like he's such an interesting case because it feels like they gave him too much personality to be relatable, but not enough to make a lot of people really care for him. But also, let's be fair, I don't really think it helps that they pitted him up against Master Chief in his first game and he took up majority of the screen time. So it's almost like he was doomed to fail from that community reception standpoint. But regardless, Locke is a character that I would like to see return in a more prominent role. It would be cool to see him act more as an ally to Chief rather than an antagonist. I'm just saying, if he shows up in the next game, still has the same helmet, but has like Rakshasa armor with some kind of poncho, that would be a really cool design. And if we had some kind of mission a bit like Nightfall from Reach, where it's you working with Locke, and it's a bit more of a stealth mission where you've got to assassinate some kind of HVT, that'd be awesome. So I feel like there's a lot of potential for Locke's character that in Halo 5 specifically was just incredibly poorly executed. Callisto 4K said this might be a hot take, it might be a cold take, but there needs to be a bigger focus on the story. Get some new writers. I don't care if it's a continuation of Infinite story or a reboot of post-Halo 3, I just want something good. Okay, now in regards to story, I want it to continue exactly from where Infinite left off. I don't want some big time gap like we had between Halo 5 and Infinite. I want the next game to take place directly after Infinite. Or if they wanted to do something smaller scale, some kind of story between 5 and Infinite would also be nice. I know we do have some books like Shadows of Reach. I mean, maybe this could continue on from my point about Locke just if we had a little short spin-off game, something akin to ODST that was more so about Locke, that builds into Infinite story and acts as this bridge between the two. That'd be nice. But overall, I want a continuation of Infinite story, and I definitely believe there needs to be more of a focus on it. It was cool during Infinite, during Season 1, 2, and 3, when we were getting story content through cutscenes, through multiplayer cutscenes, and of course, I will never not be disappointed that they decided to drop the multiplayer story. Can understand why it happened. Of course, a lot of the writers were laid off, which is extremely unfortunate, but at the same time, it was one of the main things that really kept myself and a lot of others invested in Infinite. I say that as if I don't still regularly play the game anyway, but that decision definitely took its toll on me, especially because things had just started to get really good. Bento Draws went on to say the main Infinite complaint is still the lack of content, which is ridiculous because it is objectively now got more content than any of the other Halos. What little it had at launch is completely irrelevant to conversations about the game today. It's only relevant if you're cautious about Halo 7. And yeah, I think they make a solid point here. Infinite definitely doesn't really suffer from the lack of content that it used to. The problem is now whenever anything is added, most people will either say that it's not enough or it should have been there at launch. And even if sometimes that whole should have been there at launch comment is true, personally I'm of the belief that I would rather have it late than never. And when Infinite's Forge is as powerful and as impressive as it is, which allows for endless sources of gameplay content, whether they be fun new maps or mini campaign missions, there is definitely a lot to do in this game. Don't get me wrong, I would have loved Infinite to have launched with most of the features that it now has. Things like the exchange, and forge mode, and the progression system, and so many other things. But again, I'm just glad those additions are there, and I definitely don't think Infinite suffers from the lack of content that it used to. I still have some issues with the game. There is still some things that I would improve upon, some things that I would change. But overall, yes, I do not believe this piece of criticism that Infinite suffers from is really as much of a piece of criticism that it used to be. Every time someone says that Infinite lacks content, I kind of just roll my eyes, because I think most of the time it's very clear that it comes from someone that hasn't played the game in about 12 months. Wyvern went on to say that Halo 5 has the absolute best sandbox out of any Halo game. Now, I definitely agree that it has one of the most enjoyable, because of course it has a ton of variety, especially with all of the different weapon variants, which is again something that adds on to the fun factor of modes like Warzone and Super Fiesta in that game. But I can also see why a lot of people would argue that Halo 5 sandbox feels incredibly bloated. Some people do want something that's a bit more like Halo 3, that's a bit more slimmed down and every weapon feels like it fits a unique role. And of course, some people are much happier with the more chaotic sandbox of Halo 5. I don't necessarily think I agree or disagree with this. I can fully understand people agreeing with this statement, and again, I can also see why some people would disagree with it. I love Halo 5 sandbox. I think it's a ton of fun. I love all of the different weapon variants, and I have advocated for Halo Infinite to have even more than it already does, because again, I feel like it really adds to that social side of the game. And I think that's the thing, if you're much more of a social player, then this is a take that you will be more inclined to agree with. However, I can understand that for more competitive players, Halo 5 is likely far from your favourite, which is why I can't really say that I think it's the best, because that entirely depends on the elements that you enjoy about Halo's multiplayer. Dangerville then went on to comment that Halo will never be popular again because of its community, who complain about literally anything and give each game a negative outlook to the general audience. There can be no features missing, there has to be features from previous games, no different designs, no new gameplay, or else it's bad. And I don't particularly think this is one that I agree with. Kind of. Halo is still incredibly popular, and I think even just the reveal of the Project Foundry 343 to Halo Studios name change, making its way up really high on the trending page on YouTube, shows that no matter what, people still and will always care about Halo. Even the Halo TV show, whether you love it or hate it, and again, that's not what I'm here to talk about right now, pulled in numbers because people care about this series. Halo is still popular, which is why I can't necessarily see myself agreeing with this statement, but I'm also just talking about that first part. Because yes, there is definitely a lot of people in the community who will never accept newer Halo games unless they are exactly the same as the games that they grew up with, which kind of does loop back around to some of the takes that we spoke about earlier on. There's definitely a lot of people who make things out to be much more negative than they are, and if these people have a loud enough voice, that will give the game a much more foul appearance to a casual audience. I'm not just talking about big creators in the Halo scene, but outside of that too. When you have some extremely monolithic creators like Critical, if they were to make a video talking about Halo, saying that some of the elements of the game are bad, chances are there's going to be a lot of people that watch that and then just start to agree with him. And that's absolutely no shade at Critical at all. The point I'm more so making is just that there's a lot of people that are easily influenced by some big voices, whether they're a prolific part of the Halo community or not. And there is, of course, a lot of people who, if a current modern Halo game isn't the same as Halo 3, they will instantly dislike it. Felix B143 then went on to say that Halo 3 is arguably the most disappointing game in the franchise. The story is a huge letdown post Halo 2, the actual gunplay movement is slow and clunky, most campaign missions involve too much backtracking, and the visuals do not hold up as well as some folks say. This is just one that I disagree with. I love Halo 3. Halo 3 and Halo 2 are tied for my favorite game of all time, not just my favorite Halo game. So maybe I am a little bit biased here, but I'll just break everything down. I can fully understand why some people would think that the story is a letdown in comparison to Halo 2. It definitely feels like the actual story side of things does take a bit of a back seat, but despite that, there is still some incredible story moments. Whether that be something like the Master Chief standing back to back with the Arbiter after they actually let the Arbiter be the one to eliminate the Prophet of Truth, or Chief reuniting with Cortana, which was an extremely heartfelt moment, and Johnson's death. There are some very, very impactful moments in this game's story, and although overall I don't think it is as well written as Halo 2's, I don't think that it is written poorly. It does have its moments where I know it receives a lot of criticism. We've all definitely heard Miranda Keyes say to war enough times now. But then to make up for that, I think overall its campaign as far as gameplay goes and its level design is much more enjoyable. And I say that as someone who absolutely adores Halo 2's campaign. The gunplay and movement being clunky, again, I just don't think is true. It can definitely feel that way in comparison to some of the newer games, which of course do adopt some more modern game mechanics. If you were to play a game of Halo Infinite and then go straight to Halo 3 after, I can understand for some people it would mean that Halo 3 feels even slower by comparison, but I do not think that Halo 3 does feel slow or clunky. But again, maybe that's nostalgia blinding me. I don't think that most of the campaigns involve too much backtracking. Some of them definitely have a little bit, but I feel like there's enough to go on within those missions that even the ones that have backtracking, it's not really that noticeable. And the part about the visuals, I mean, aside from some of the human faces, I guess not aging the best, I do think Halo 3 is still a pretty good looking game. It does have some incredible lighting, and I also really like the game's art style. This is a statement that a few people seemed to agree with, so Felix definitely isn't alone there, and again, people are entitled to feel this way. Halo 3, I can understand why it might be a disappointment to some people. There is of course a lot of people that love the Arbiter as a character, and he doesn't get to do as much in Halo 3, which can definitely be a bit of a letdown. But I also think overall its campaign is potentially the most enjoyable to play through. Cinnamon Sprink then went on to say that the energy sword wasn't used very well in Reach. I really hate the fact that you can parry an energy sword with a melee attack. I think that's incredibly stupid. Brightroot 2 then stated that the Didact was the most interesting idea for a character that 343 had, and it's a shame they got rid of him immediately after introducing him. This is another one that I agree with. I don't really think this is a hot take. I've seen a lot of people share this sentiment, but yes, the Didact should have played much more of a part in the actual games themselves. He of course had a lot of backstory and even a continuation in some of the books, which is nice, don't get me wrong, but his story definitely should have been continued through Halo 5 and even Halo Infinite. He could have really served as a great rival character to the Master Chief, so it is a shame in my opinion that they didn't really do more with him. The next take is from Mr. Madis 112, and they said that there is no Halo game that is bad, quite the contrary. All the games in the franchise are good. They have their flaws, but overall they are good games. The biggest complaints about the latest games come from nostalgia above all. And man, for the most part, there is not a single Halo game that I really dislike. Spartan Assault and Spartan Strike aren't particularly my cup of tea. Aside from that though, I have loved and enjoyed every single Halo game that I have played. Yes, I do have my issues with some of them here and there, but at the end of the day, this is my favourite series. I grew up with it, I have so many memories with it, and I just think Halo is absolutely incredible. Even some of the games that people consider to be the worst ones, whether that be Halo 4, Halo 5, or Infinite, still retain some incredible qualities. I would argue that Halo 4 has one of the best stories in the series, and I love the way that Master Chief's and Cortana's relationship is handled in that game. Halo 5's story I don't think was anywhere near as strong, but still retains some incredibly enjoyable moments in the campaign from a gameplay perspective, and also introduced some of the most enjoyable multiplayer modes like Warzone. And Halo Infinite, well, I don't really think I'd be making this video without that game. Infinite is a game that has genuinely somehow changed my life, which is insane. It has given me a multitude of opportunities, and I've met so many really cool people through it. And one of the next videos I am working on is a bit of a deep dive into Infinite, a little bit of a retrospective type thing. I've got one about the campaign, which is much further away, but it's more so one about Infinite deserving a second chance. Because, man, I love the series, I love these games, and I think that is a good place to wrap this video up. I know out of the 200 comments on this post, I really didn't manage to get through that many. And again, as I've said, I will try to cover a few over the course of a few shorts that will go up over the next couple of weeks. Or maybe, if people want me to, I'll do a part 2 to this video to try and cover another large sum of the comments. Anyways, thank you for watching. Maybe drop some of your hot takes for the Halo series under the comments for this video. Let me know if you would like a part 2 at some point. Like I said, I will definitely make a few shorts going over them. But with all out of the way, I'll catch you all in the next one.